Shout out to Gman Boxing.
Okay, part two. We had a good chat about part one on your channel, and we talked
We
about a
did.
little bit of a breakdown, how we think this fight's going to go. So I got the luxury of having part two, the best part. The second half is always the most entertaining. So we're talking about Tank Davis, Ryan Garcia, but we've done the breakdown already. Link to that is in the description. But we gonna want to talk about the economics of this fight, which is an interesting one as well. You know, the economics, the money. There's people are speculating on the buys, what the buy range they are forecasting, what other people are forecasting. It's a bit all over the place. One thing we know is that it's a big fight. I think we don't anyone has got to doubt that it's a massive fight. But in terms of the economics of this fight, what are we looking at in your opinion? Do you think we're seeing a sub million or over a million?
Yeah. For myself, sub a million. I've got some friends at Showtime actually, and they've spoken to me out, internal projections and the algorithm for what they use to calculate fights of this nature. And it's built on so many different metrics, sub metrics. You've got engagement with hashtags, whole list of things. And they've said to me that this is looking at around about, as a ballpark figure, 650 would be a good number. 650 would be a good number. But there is also a caveat to that. And that caveat being that this is $85. So this now actually matches the UFC pay-per-view pricing. And that usually for mega fights in America, those guys are accustomed to paying $79, $99 for the likes of Wilder Fury 2. That's what they've been paying for a few years now. But that price hike has just notched up a little bit incrementally to $85 now. And that now mirrors what UFC charged most recently for Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman. So it's interesting times ahead. But let's say, G-Man, without that price change, let's imagine a world where on Saturday evening, it still costs $79.99, the usual pay-per-view price in America. What do you think pay-per-views for Davis versus Garcia would have been, and why?
It's a bit shocking to hear their forecasting, I should say, sub 1 million, especially in the 600s. Like, that's insane. Obviously, the price is steep. I mean, I know we do it over here. We complain.
Of course.
That 27 quid. For a fight like Fury Chisora, I think that's fair to complain. But all things considered, that's a pretty big difference. Pretty big difference. I really would have thought even with that price, it would have done over 1 million. But it's going to be interesting to see the figures. If it was cheaper, I mean, like, we're in a pretty bad, especially in the US. I mean, the US are absolutely they're in a real bad place with their economy. So $10 in America today goes a long way.
Yeah, I mean, exchange rates notwithstanding. If past is prologue, right? Let's use past as prologue. Gervonta Davis has had 4 pay-per-view fights, 1 each since 2020. The most recent one being against Hector Luis Garcia. That was a few months ago. All of those have done an absolute minimum of 200,000 buys. The maximum that any one of them have done is 250,000. So if past is prologue, 200,000 is the floor. That's the absolute minimum we're working with here.
Wow.
What? I'm curious, when you said you were expecting around about 1 million-ish, or that ballpark region for this fight, what did you base that on? Based on what Ryan Garcia brings, isolated as an outright name? Or did you think it was
more so what Garcia as well brings to the table? You know,
Okay.
I think he's bringing. I think it's not just Garcia. It's a sense of you're clashing so many different blends of personality. You know, you're bringing, and what I mean by that is you're bringing so many different fan personalities. You're bringing, with Tank Davis, you know, you're bringing the African Americans. You're bringing the PBC fans. With Ryan Garcia, you're bringing the Mexicans. You're also bringing the fact that he's a very big influencer. You know, he's got millions and millions of followers. So you're bringing them over as well. And I thought kind of by default, you're just guaranteed inflating numbers for that reason, because of the demographic that both guys attract, so to speak, and both guys are part of. So I know Garcia is a bit of an interesting one because he's actually not done a pay-per-view yet. So we have no ballpark figure. all we can
Correct.
go on is basically all we can go on is the viewing figures we've got kind of from the zone, which is obviously it's different. You know, I mean, like he's never fought on pay-per-view. He's fought on standard the zone. So it's, again, very different. But you look at his fan base, you look at the amount of followers he brings. I mean, like you look at him when he is fighting. It does have a very kind of YouTube-esque kind of style, these misfit shows, kind of almost that kind of style when you're seeing Garcia fight. And I kind of think that with them, when they know Ryan is fighting, especially with someone who's more of a name than a Luke Campbell or someone like that, you just think, all right, they are going to come out and they're going to lap this up. And likewise with Tank Davis, you know, at the end of the day, putting a pay-per-view between him and Pitbull on, putting the pay-per-view between him and Hector Luis Garcia and Leo Santa Cruz for that matter, at the end of the day, those guys aren't big names in their own right. They're good fighters, but they're not big names. So you could be a Tank Davis who they're trying to sell as a pay-per-view star, but again, how big a star is he going to be if he has a dance partner who no one hears of, who no one heard of? You know, to us, the hardcores, we know about them, but to the casual you're trying to sell that to, they'd be like, who the hell is this guy? Why am I going to pay $75 when I don't even know who this guy is?
Yeah, I think in light of what you just said there are two questions I'm going to flip back to you. So the first of those being, you mentioned that Ryan's never done a pay-per-view before. And so in terms of him, he's completely unknown, whereas Gervonta Davis is a relatively known quantity. We know that 200 is the floor, but we're not quite sure how thick the glass ceiling is, what his potential is. With Ryan, we don't have the floor and we don't have the ceiling either. It's a completely unknown quantity. Now, the question about that I was going to ask you was, you also mentioned about Ryan and the Mexican fan base. Relatability. When someone can't speak the language of a nation, the way they connect is completely different to the likes of Canelo Alvarez, for example. Ryan Garcia not speaking Spanish, how big of a barrier do you think that is to getting the Mexicans on board with him specifically?
Well, that's a very, very interesting and very good point there, because very astute point, because yes, Canelo Alvarez, his first language, of course, is Spanish. We know that. I mean, his English is, you listen to it and you giggle because how poor it is, you know, how strange it sounds. Whereas Ryan Garcia is the polar opposite. You know, even if he spoke Spanish, it would have an American accent to it. So it is very, very strange. Oh, it is. It's a very good point you actually raised there. Very interesting one. That might actually that's one I haven't really thought about now, to be fair.
Because relatability is so, people buy into, in terms of storytelling, buying pay-per-views, being invested in a character. If you look at someone like, for example, Anthony Joshua on the come up, or George Groves, there was a boy next door gimmick. Do you know what I mean? From rags to riches, people get behind and support people they can relate to. People, whether they be the same ethnicity, same social class, whatever that may be, whatever barometer that is, people get behind who they can relate to. With Ryan Garcia, because in the case of Latino communities and Hispanic communities, speaking Spanish and Hispanic culture is so important to them, not being able to resonate with that fully, I feel that does handicap, not to a huge degree, because Garcia being an English speaker opens more doors than any other language on planet Earth, inherently, by virtue of speaking English, of course. But in the case of Spanish, he's not isolating himself from that demographic completely, but he's definitely not penetrating them to the degree that someone like a Canelo Alvarez or a significantly smaller star in that regard could. And that's where I feel that Ryan is going to heavily appeal to Western markets. But
we already know that.
South American markets, color me in skeptical on that for the time being. How about you?
It's a very good point. As I said, it's a very astute point. It's not something I've really given much thought to, but when you mention that again, the key word there to me is relatability.
Relatability.
You know, Alvarez is just, he's Mexican through and through. You know, and
but you know Garcia, what? There is a caveat to that. He initially faced hostility because of his appearance. He wasn't the stereotypical Mexican. He was a white-skinned, ginger hair male, and that's not something most Americans can resonate with, because most Americans have a skin color. Sorry, Mexicans have a skin color somewhere in between yourself and I. You know, that sort of complexion. But Canelo bucked the trend of what you'd normally expect a Mexican to be. So that limited it to a degree, no?
At the start, possibly, but it seemed like they forgot about that fairly quick.
Yeah, I think the Josecito Lopez fight would have been the turning point to that. Because, again, with relatability, Mexican style, Canelo initially, that was a specific point where he completely switched up. And, Mexico, when you've got a counterpuncher who leans forwards behind the high guard, the peekaboo guard, that's, if you compare that to someone like David Benavidez, who lets his hands go as soon as he's in the pocket, that's what Mexicans relate to a lot more, and they can get behind a lot more. So it's an interesting barometer. What else do you think helped Canelo penetrate that market a lot deeper outside of just his wins? Do you think there's anything else?
It's a strange one for me because I don't really, I guess for me, kind of, it might have been the fact that really at the time there was really nobody there there was no star coming out of Mexico at the time. And I think Canelo, in a way, you could argue maybe he filled the void that was left by De La Hoya, because Marquez didn't really even get to that. I think as well as that, you have to remember Chavez Jr. was getting a lot of hype around him, and he was certainly getting pushed by HBO, certainly around kind of from 2011 to 2012, really, were his years. But I think it was fairly obvious that was an exercise in futility pushing him. Whereas I think at that point was kind of when Canelo started really coming onto the scene, properly onto the scene. He was already on the scene, but this is when he started really coming onto the scene. And I think that was kind of when people were like, okay, we might have something here. He is relatable. Let's have something, because Chavez, his father, was amazing. He was a hero in Mexico, but the apple fell a million miles away. I mean, he crossed the Atlantic and kept going far from the tree. That's the type of thing with Chavez Jr.
Yeah, no, that analogy isn't a million miles from the truth either. Yeah, I do get what you mean in that sense. I do get what you mean. But yeah, I think that with Ryan, I think language barrier will always be a barrier. But then the other caveat to that being sex appeal. He appeals to both male markets from the boxing side of things and to female markets from the sex appeal angle. So it's similar to Anthony Joshua, or like Oscar De La Hoya being a better example, actually, in that when you appeal to both genders, you put two sets of bums on seats at events. So rather than just a single ticket purchase, it's a two automatically. Every ticket purchased, you're bringing your wife or your girlfriend along with your fiance or something. Do you know what I mean? And so,
and you're bringing the girlfriend's boyfriend who's like, oh, I want to see him get beat because my missus likes him.
They polarizing. That's another thing that could work for Ryan, in that he's like, from what I've gauged, and again, your social media, you may see something different in terms of perception, but from what I've gauged on mine, and just generally across the internet, there's a very strong dislike towards him from hardcore boxing fans. His attitude and the way he carries himself, there's a very strong resentment, but that's based on the sample size I've seen. How about yourself?
Hard to say. Like, I'll be honest with you, I don't really tend to follow a lot of Ryan Garcia, kind of that area on social media. I know he didn't endear himself a couple of years ago when, I think he offered Linares at one point, and he was like, oh, I want more, I want more money, when he never even fought any step up and was demanding X amount of money. So I think he kind of came across back then as a bit of a throw toys out of the pram type of guy. And, Golden Boy actually really, although he was obviously signed with, still is, they were kind of like, Virgil Ortiz is better. They were kind of those little sly digs, the best prospect in world boxing, they were calling him, as a bit of a sly dig to Ryan. So I think he didn't help endear himself to the fans by kind of coming across as spoiled brat back then. And I don't know, like I say, I don't follow him enough to see what the kind of reaction is to him. I don't really tend to look at kind of how boxing fans are reacting to this fight or that fight, because I really, most people, they don't know people, but yet they automatically take a dislike to them for whatever reason. It's just bizarre. It's like they put someone like Fury up on a pedestal without knowing him, but then again, they'll just turn around and say, Joshua was this, he failed this. Like, what proof do you have? None. We just know he did. It's like, oh yeah, because I knew I was Nostradamus in a past life, which is why I get all my predictions right. But it's not exactly true, is it?
It's really funny you mentioned that example specifically, because once upon a time, Tyson Fury was not one of, he was the public enemy number one in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the most hated.
Number one, not one. He was literally pound for pound the most hated fighter in the
You
UK,
would
and it's remarkable to see the U-turn in
you
the
would
space
see
of
people
how many
giving him
years?
nothing but 7 years, 6 years, no 6 years.
6 years from 2015 when he went
It was
off the rails.
2019. Yeah, 2015 was probably when he was at his worst in terms of people just did not like him. And then kind of 2019 was when the ball shifted in the other way. It was shifting before that, but that's when it was just like boom
Yeah,
to the stratosphere.
the ball got rolling after the first Wilder fight. The second Wilder fight, that was the Mount Everest moment. That was the Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, that was him at his absolute peak in terms of everything. Really, that was peak.
Yeah, and it's an inverse relationship with Anthony Joshua, who was the nation's golden child, the poster boy, the face of British boxing, at the same time that coincided with when Tyson Fury was down here. And it's remarkable in the sense that Joshua's popularity went from up here all the way down here, and Tyson Fury's popularity went from down here all the way to up there. And even now, we're seeing the pendulum shift again,
The thing
where
I
the
find
public
remarkable,
attitudes towards them are changing. It's crazy how the pendulum, it shifts.
the thing I find remarkable is those who would have been cursing Fury and saying all this, that, and the other about him are now the ones who are saying Joshua was a drug cheat. You can't make it up. Like,
I mean, particularly with casual boxing fans, it's very much you're only as good as your last fight. And like you said earlier, with Leo Santa Cruz, for example, yourself and I, as hardcore boxing fans, will know who that is. But to the casual fans, they won't even remember when Gervonta Davis fought that guy, let alone got that highlight reel knockout. So
October 2020.
There you go.
In Texas.
The pandemic.
In Texas.
So in Texas, there you go. He's done his homework, everyone.
In front of 10,000 fans.
10,000
or 15,000. 10 or 15,000 was one or the other.
Yeah, there you go. But things like that, hardcores will acknowledge that. But to the casual fans, they won't do. And, going back to the Ryan versus Tank pay-per-view figures, this is boxing's biggest issue at the moment. There is now a substitute product that has a globally embedded footprint. And that wasn't the case before in the case of UFC. Mm-hmm. Now, boxing, in terms of the ecosystem and the finances of how boxing and Ultimate Fighting Championship work, the business is predicated on a customer pool which forms 80% of the market plus of casual fans. They are the lifeblood of the sport. They fund the pay-per-views, and without them and their support, boxing wouldn't get TV spots on Sky, BT, etc., etc. The casual fans form the biggest proportion of money in the sport. They predicate their custom where they feel they get the greatest value for money. And over the last few years, what I think's become increasingly apparent and that we've spoken about over the phone is that customer satisfaction for boxing as a whole is getting progressively lower and lower and lower and lower in terms of the undercard quality. The biggest fights right at the top, the Spence Crawfords, the AJ Fury's not getting made. And people then look around them and they see a substitute product that's an alternative with a globally embedded footprint and think to themselves, I'm going to give this a try. And this is why Ryan Tank, for myself, the way I see it, this is the fight that has to do very, very well for boxing's long-term future. And I'm going to ask you the question I asked you on the phone the other day. Could you name for me across any weight divisions in boxing, you've got the freedom to pick any, post Canelo, post Joshua, the next generation down, could you think of any two names, Gman, in world boxing that would gain more public interest and eyeballs than Ryan Garcia and Gervonta Davis? Any pairing?
No. Well, that's a damn indictment because I can't think of any from the next crop that would do that other than these two.
This is the best product, isn't it? Of the next generation, this is the best product.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
This is it. The only thing I could maybe think of is if Tank Davis wins and Teofimo Lopez wins, or it's not Tank Davis, if Ryan Garcia wins and Teofimo Lopez wins, then they meet at 140. Yes, that could potentially, but that's not probably on this level, I don't think. I think Tank Davis is still a bigger name.
once upon a time, I would have agreed with that. But since the loss from the
Cambosis.
credit card against Cambosis, and then the performances subsequently against Sandor Martin, for example, Teofimo Lopez's stock is not what it used to be once upon a time. And so I think you'd have to colour me in skeptical on that. I'm not sure Lopez would have had that same crossover appeal.
Hard to say, but I think I give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I'm just
Yeah.
being generous, but I give him the benefit of the doubt, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. And I mean, the question I'd ask you would be, if this does brilliantly, is this going to be the catalyst for a chain reaction of fights that follow? I mean, rumor on the street being Spence and Crawford is due to be announced at this event, but naturally speculation is speculation.
Yeah.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant, so whatever transpires, transpires. But for this fight, is this going to be the catalyst that gets everyone else to get their shit together?
I hope, because you're talking about two fighters with two rival promoters and two rival networks being able to just say, right, let's iron it out, let's get it made. I think if these can do it, and especially considering that De La Hoya and Al Heyman really don't like one another, like there's a really bad relationship there stemming back a decade. If they can do it and coexist and work together at DAZN, Showtime, PBC, can all do this, then surely it should be easy to make other fights as well. Like I surely this will be the kind of straw that breaks the camel's back. It opens the floodgates to more. I would hope. I think it depends on how well it does, because I think if it doesn't do well, promoters, not necessarily fight promoters, might look at it and be like, it didn't do that well. What's it worth our while going over and having to deal with any of this? They might want this, they might want this, they might want this. For what? For 600,000 buys? It's not worth it.
Yeah. Well, we hope not. That could be on the cards for sure. In terms of promotion, because I saw you float a few names around there, outside of Showtime with the All Access package, which is a 2-part documentary, I haven't really seen DAZN do much of the heavy lifting as of yet for promotion of this fight. How about yourself?
Not necessarily, no. They've done a little bit, but not a great deal. I think maybe Showtime. Look, at the end of the day, Showtime have been around a lot longer than DAZN. They're a proven commodity when it comes to doing the all access and stuff like that. People expect that more so from Showtime. So, Showtime have been doing that since the 80s, where DAZN have only been around a few years. You would expect the heavy lifting in terms of that end to come from Showtime just by default, because they're the ones with and I think DAZN would probably look at that and say, do you know what, like, at the end of the day, they're the ones who've been doing this longer. We're still putting it on. At the end of the day, it's more accessible to watch, because it's not, this is a pay-per-view on DAZN, as far as I'm aware. You don't have to be a subscriber to pay for it. Whereas, Showtime, the all access and all, I'm pretty sure you can just access that by default. I'm pretty sure anyone can access that. Whereas even if they done an all access on DAZN, you probably have to subscribe to it, or more than likely, or at the very least, have the app. Whereas Showtime, it's just a case of, there you go, boom.
But you know what, Gman?
Accessibility.
I think there is one thing I would say to play devil's advocate. You mentioned that Showtime had the bigger footprint. They've been in the game longer, for example, than DAZN. Wouldn't this be the perfect time then for DAZN to embed their footprint in the sand? Hypothetically.
You would think that. You would think that. At the end of the day, we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Obviously the two companies, the two networks have to agree on things. And who's to say that DAZN didn't just say, look, we want to do this just as much as you do. Okay, you want to do the lion's share of promoting, fine. But we're doing the pay-per-view as well. So, and if it's a rematch, who's to say that if Ryan wins, we have a rematch, it's a close fight. Running it back in the rematch, who's to say DAZN won't have the rights to do the lion's share of promoting? The all access will be on the DAZN end rather than the Showtime end. At the end of the day, there is a rematch there. It's a rematch clause. I'm sure there is, at least on Tank's part. So, and I know DAZN will.
It's bilateral.
Yeah, it's bilateral. I know that DAZN will probably. I know that the original talk was that this fight be a Showtime pay-per-view and then the rematch be a DAZN pay-per-view. It's not that way, but I would imagine that maybe the Showtime have said, okay, we get to do it this time around the majority of the promotion with regards to all access, whereas DAZN next time roles are reversed. There's a channel I listen to where it's two people, they're very, very good co-hosts, and they do a show on one channel one week and one's the next week. They rotate it. so as though everyone gets a fair share of the pie. So I think it's just the way it is.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think it's interesting in the sense that, you know, what you were saying about sharing or distributing that more evenly, and that if hypothetically Showtime were to do the first leg, if we think of it like a football match, the first leg is a home game for Showtime, and the next one being an away leg at DAZN's place.
Yeah.
There is one caveat to that. Rematches quite often are bigger than the first one. And once people have had a sample size, one scoop of the ice cream and gone, yeah, this is nice, or this isn't, well, they've gauged whatever they wanted to, and they think to themselves, right, next time the shot's open tomorrow, we're going to get 2 or 3 scoops. And so inherently, the pay-per-view numbers then catapult for whoever is that ultimate beneficiary, being the second person to stage it, right? So
you would think that, but it all is based on how good the fight is and how conclusive the result is. I mean, let's just say hypothetically we go in here and Tank Davis just goes in, finds Ryan Garcia in a couple of rounds, keeps him on the jab, and then knocks him out in the 4th round, rematch and vote. Do we really want to see? You know, it'd be like Devin Haney versus Kambosos. I know it's not going to be as dull as that was, but it's like, okay, rematch. If you were, say, for argument's sake, say Devin Haney was a DAZN fighter, still going into that fight, let's imagine Top Rank 1 got the first fight, they showed it on ESPN, and DAZN say, okay, now we get to play the rematch. No one was really that excited for the rematch. You kind of be like, oh, all right, brilliant, we get the rematch. But yeah, do we really think it's going to do crazy numbers? Probably not. And it didn't really. What the rematch was what it was. So there's always a risk, you know, if the fight's one-sided or if it's not entertaining the first time around, it could turn a lot of people off the second time around. So you don't know. At the same time, it could be an absolute barn burner. It could be a Gary Ward type fight, and DAZN are like, happy days, we get the lion's share next time.
Could I talk you into a theory potentially? Because you said there the example of Devin Haney and Kambosos, there was customer fatigue. But if you look at a like-for-like example, neither Haney or Kambosos are big names. Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury are. Now, after how conclusive the rematch between Deontay and Tyson was, there was significant customer fatigue going into that trilogy. There was a waning public interest, and people thought to themselves, on the basis of what I've seen in both the rematch and the first fight as well, do I really want to pay, in our case, 25 quid, or in the States, 79.99, to see a third episode of this? I don't think there's that customer fatigue for Ryan and Tank, because there are so many more unanswered questions. Do you know what I mean? And when there's 2 big punches, you definitely don't really know what's going to happen either. So could I talk you into the idea that whatever happens between Ryan and Tank, you could always set a rematch because of how many unknown questions that are left answered?
I mean, I'm sure there probably is, but I think, again, it depends on the nature of the defeat for either guy, how it goes, you know? I'm sure there definitely is. I'm sure they'll probably take something away from it, but I guess it all depends on how it's going to be. Like, I think it's going to be a long, drawn-out affair, so I think it's going to have public won't get fatigue anytime soon, the way I see it going, but you just don't know. I'm not Nostradamus, as I said, I can't judge and say, Saturday this is going to happen, when something completely different could happen.
Of course, no worries. And in terms of boxing's future, how do you see this fight being looked at 10 years from now? And this is a very difficult question to answer. I'm not so sure myself. 10 years from now, when we look back at Ryan Garcia versus Tank Davis, will we look back at this fight as being the catalyst that ultimately led to a series of fights being made after? Or we look back at it and think, this was the last roll of the dice, and this was boxing's final nail in the coffin to being overtaken as the premier combat sport globally?
I don't think you'll ever overtake it, but I think that I'm hoping it does. I'm hoping it is. This is the caveat to get the bigger fights done. But I think boxing will always be that premier sport. I think I just think it always will be. I think it'll always have that. I think there's no fighter bigger than the sport of boxing.
What's your reasoning?
Same can't be said. Same can't be said for UFC. It's the brand. I think there's no fighter bigger than boxing. I think there's always going to be fighters coming through who will bring new fans in. And even if they're fighting, God knows who, like Joshua. Well, Joshua fought loads of good fighters. The Fury, as much as I don't like his style of picking this fight here and this fight there and not fighting new sec people like that, people are always going to want to watch him. I think boxing, put it like this, right? UFC is on once every couple of weeks. in the world of boxing, there's not a day there's not a boxing match in the world. You go on BoxRec, there is not one single day there's not a boxing event.
Is it
And
of
it has that
interest,
reach.
though? Enough interest to captivate the public interest? Because this is where I used to think to myself that boxing, if you look at it, it has centuries of history behind it. UFC has been around for 30 years. And the inherent nature of boxing, where it's easy to understand, it's two guys punching each other. With UFC, there's the ground game, takedowns, grappling on the fence line. It's more complicated. And to the eye test, it's less appealing to most casuals. Where I think that there are two key business points here that I think have tilted the balance. Before, boxing had a globally embedded footprint and there wasn't a substitute product that people had the luxury of looking at. In the 70s and the 80s, there were 5 TV channels. Like, if we go and ask our parents, there are 5 TV channels. There wasn't an iPad where if you were unhappy with something, you could look for a library of things on Netflix, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
The business market is completely different now. And the two main metrics I wanted to speak about are social media and the substitute product element. That substitute product of UFC now has a globally embedded footprint. It's already taken boxing in terms of under 30s age category viewership. And if you look at the social media traction, like I'll give you a statistic here, Khabib Nurmagomedov has almost as many Instagram followers as Canelo Alvarez, Anthony Joshua, and Tyson Fury put together. If we rewound 10 years ago, no one in the UFC or MMA would have come close to the public brand of a Mayweather or a Pacquiao. And that's another thing in the sense that John Jones versus Cyril Gane did just under 1 million pay-per-view buys in the UFC around about a month ago. That was at an $85 price point as well. With Ryan Garcia and Tank Davis, these are 2 dance partners. There are 2 draws. Cyril Gane wasn't. John Jones was an outright entity. That's where I think the balance does tilt in a way it wouldn't have done yesteryear. And I don't think boxing can rely on its history to bail it out this time because the business ecosystem doesn't allow it to. Social media has completely changed global commerce, whether that be consumer markets, marketing, and a whole host of different metrics, which I'm not going to bore you guys with all the jargon surrounding that. But the landscape has now completely changed. And the worrying thing for boxing is that the pandemic is when people started turning their heads and thinking, do you know what? There's a substitute product here that satisfies my blood and guts needs, so to speak. And now that has a globally embedded footprint, that's where boxing will struggle because in Oceania, Australia, boxing has now been overtaken. It's been overtaken. In South America, boxing is still more popular. In mainland Europe, boxing has been overtaken in terms of viewership, social media traction, and pay-per-view buys. And the UFC have now layered their model in a way where the overall product, the actual quality of pay-per-views has reduced because they do fight night cards every week. It's done to polish up the overall product. And by making that product well-rounded in terms of the freebies that you get to see for free every week, people then see a sample size of that and go, these are relatively even matches. They're of interest to us. Let's go and buy the pay-per-view. Whereas with boxing, like you and I, we love the likes of David Benavidez versus Caleb Plant. But to the casual fans, they want to see Joshua Fury. Like, the equivalent of the mega fights and the big fights. That's something I think we need to distinguish between in boxing, where Spence Crawford, AJ Wilder, those are the fights that get casuals hooked. Devin Haney, Lomachenko, you and I will love that. But as we spoke about earlier, in terms of context within the market, you and I are hardcore boxing fans. We form sub 20% of the market. And that's where I do worry for boxing. And it's really sad to say. But I've said a lot.
I'll always
there,
defend
so over
boxing.
to you.
I've always defend boxing. It's as simple as that. It's my sport. I love it. I'll always defend it. And for me, it'll always be the best. Nothing will ever change.
Yeah.
Nothing will ever change with that. No, I can't wait for this fight on Saturday. I think it's going to be brilliant. Of course, I'm going to stay up for it. And we're going to have lots to talk about, no doubt, following on thereafter.
Of
thereafter,
course.
mate.
What do you make of the undercard, just quickly?
I would have like it's not great. I'm not gonna lie. Vodcek is on it. I'm interested to see just how he looks, given the fact he's been. Well, I know it's a second comeback fight, but apart from him, that's it. Like it's not a. And that's it's a weird thing. Normally, when you see cross promotional shows, you do tend to see a slightly better undercard because they tend to sometimes match their guys, like they did with the Jagba versus Sanchez. This is a bit of a letdown, if I'm honest. It's all right. But it's the kind of undercard where you're like, yeah, so it's like, yeah. Whereas I kind of think, like, if you look across promotional shows like Wilder Fury, both cards, well, all three of them, they always had a decent enough undercard, especially the third fight. That was a great undercard. That was actually a phenomenally good undercard. It was brilliant. Really good undercard, that.
Of course. And I think on that note, I think we've gone through the agenda.
We've done it all, mate. We've filled it all. We wrapped it all up. We got through it all good. So, like as I said, obviously you've got part 1 on your channel. Link will be into that. This is part 2. So I hope you all enjoy it. Have a listen, leave a like, have a listen to both. Makes more sense, as it always is with part 1 and part 2. Listen to part 1 first, then come over and have an Elgander at part 2. Have an Elgander at part 2. And as always, hit the old like button on the way out. Help your boy out. Link to all of our social media accounts are in both. Obviously, mine are on part 1. Raf's are on this one. Have a look there. And you want anything to add, mate?
And thank you for having me. I'm humbled to have come on, and
as am
also thank you to your subscribers and your listeners as well. Thank you guys for having me. The pleasure's mine.
Mate, it's been a pleasure. I am sure it's going to be a great fight. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it. And it's free. We don't have pay-per-view over here. Just going to chuck that out there. Not for this fight, so we got lucky. I know any of my American fans are going to be hitting the dislike button here and that, but it's true. I can't shy away from it. I'll be watching it. But for now, lads, I'll leave you with that. Hope you enjoyed it. Peace.